Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the dark, literally apocalyptic stakes of a civilization that managed to weaponize its own survival. I mean, imagine a world where the greatest empire in known history, the Valyrian Freehold, right? A civilization so impossibly advanced that its roads stretched for thousands of miles, and its sorcerers could just shape stone like wet clay. And then suddenly, it all vanished. Mountains exploded. Entire cities disappeared in a matter of days. The world as they knew it ended in a smoking graveyard. But from those ashes, a single, terrifyingly ambitious family emerged. This is the story of House Targaryen and how they built an empire not just on the backs of fire-breathing monsters, but on a foundation of profound psychological manipulation. So it begs a pretty fascinating question. Who truly builds the most dangerous empires? We usually tend to think history belongs to the conquerors. You know, the strongest, the richest, or the most feared. But the historical truth we're unpacking today is actually completely unexpected. Back in the days of Valyria, the Targaryens were absolutely none of those things. They were just a minor house. They were one among dozens of dragonlord families ruling from these impossible black fortresses. Because, as it turns out, the most dangerous empires aren't always built by the strongest. They're built by the survivors. Okay, let's really dive into this. The Targaryens survived the doom of Valyria solely because of one girl, Daenerys the Dreamer. She had this apocalyptic vision of Valyria just being totally consumed by fire, and her father actually believed her. They abandoned their estates, their status, their entire homeland, and fled west to a remote, rocky volcanic outpost called Dragonstone. When the doom actually hit, wiping out literally every other Dragonlord family, the Targaryens were left as the absolute sole survivors. But here's the genius part. They didn't just stay refugees. They took their mere survival and completely transformed it into a powerful mythology. They became chosen, a bloodline preserved by destiny itself. They figured out early on that a lasting empire couldn't be built just on dragonfire. It had to be built on the belief that they were fundamentally more than human.
Which brings us to Act 1, the tactical revolution.
So 400 years before the War of the Five Kings, Westeros was trapped in this permanent equilibrium of horizontal warfare. 7 kingdoms, constant war, and absolutely no side strong enough to actually dominate the others. Castles defined power. Generals thought in terms of rivers, supply lines, heavy cavalry charges, and choke points. And then, Aegon Targaryen introduced vertical warfare. He brought 3 dragons, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes. Just look at Harrenhal. King Harrenhal built these massive walls, thicker than any siege engine could ever hope to break. Against horizontal armies, Harrenhal was invincible. But against dragons, Harren fundamentally misunderstood the problem. Aegon didn't besiege Harrenhal. He simply ignored the geometry of the walls. Balerion flew right over them, literally melting stone and turning this ultimate fortress into a monument of strategic irrelevance overnight. The absolute absurdity of fighting this new threat became glaringly clear at the Field of Fire. The Reach and the Westerlands teamed up and assembled this traditional military juggernaut. We're talking tens of thousands of heavy cavalry and professional infantry. They brought traditional military superiority. Aegon brought 3 dragons. It wasn't even a battle, really. It was a demonstration. Flame just rolled across the open ground, turning armor into ovens and organized horse charges into panicked stampedes. Thousands died in minutes. Aegon proved, once and for all, that military power no longer belonged to whoever raised the largest army on the ground. It belonged to whoever controlled the sky. And that's exactly why the Conquest was so incredibly short. Dragons eliminated the need for battles entirely. Once the lords of Westeros understood that resistance wasn't just difficult, but mathematically impossible, submission became the only rational choice left. True empires are built by making war feel entirely, completely hopeless for your enemies.
Moving right along to Act 2, weaponizing the myth.
Now, winning a continent and actually ruling it are 2 very, very different things. Dragons are fantastic at destroying armies, for sure, but they are terrible at collecting taxes. They can't govern, and they definitely cannot force millions of people to genuinely believe in your right to rule. So the greatest threat House Targaryen faced wasn't military at all. It was ideological. To maintain their identity, the Targaryen bloodline relied heavily on sibling marriage, which, to the faith of the Seven, the dominant religion in Westeros, was a monstrous sacrilege.
Ruling through force alone would have meant endless, exhausting rebellion. So King Jaehaerys I and Queen Alysanne basically hacked the religious system. They introduced the doctrine of exceptionalism. It was this incredibly elegant, calculated policy arguing that Targaryens were chosen by destiny, and therefore they just weren't governed by the laws of common people.
Let's walk through exactly how they pulled this off. Step 1. Claim divine exceptionalism. Step 2. Co-opt the religious institutions. The faith adapted to power, as institutions so often do, and the High Septon officially legitimized the dynasty. Incest wasn't just tolerated anymore, royal exceptionalism became a holy doctrine. And step 3, well, this is the masterstroke. They turned rebellion into sacrilege. What looked like a weird biological obsession became a sacred, holy tradition. Now, rebelling against the Targaryens wasn't just political treason, it was spiritual disobedience. They completely transformed their military supremacy into cultural permanence. They stopped being foreign conquerors and became inevitable. But that leads us directly into Act 3, the seeds of madness. Because every empire eventually begins consuming itself. The exact same blood policy that created their divine exclusivity, it also created their ultimate biological fragility. Generation after generation of narrowing bloodlines took a really dark psychological toll on the family. What began as this brilliant, calculated strategy morphed into a dangerous obsession. Now, you've likely heard the famous saying that when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin. And while that isn't biologically literally true, myths reveal a lot about how societies think. This quote perfectly reflects the sheer terror Westeros felt being ruled by a family with unlimited, unchecked authority and a completely unpredictable psychology. Some of their kings united the realm, built roads, and thrived. Others literally burned people alive. Genius and catastrophe lived inside the exact same house. You see, absolute power creates isolation, and that isolation creates a kind of instability that becomes inherited. We see it in their traits: brilliance, cruelty, vision, paranoia. Every single Targaryen child grew up under the crushing, impossible burden of being told they were destiny. Just imagine carrying that weight. When you're supposed to be a literal god, every minor weakness is a total failure. Every tiny disagreement is a massive betrayal. Every fear becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their own mythology completely trapped them, making it impossible for them to ever admit they were really just regular people riding monsters. Act 4, the nuclear catastrophe. So what happens when those monsters finally turn on each other? Empires built on overwhelming force usually collapse when they stop fearing external enemies and start fighting themselves. The Dance of the Dragons wasn't just some messy political succession crisis, it was the ultimate strategic failure of their nuclear deterrent. Before the dance, the Targaryens held a complete monopoly on air power, which guaranteed peace and submission. Deterrence really only works when you are the absolute only one holding the weapon. But during the dance, both factions possessed dragons, symmetrical air power. The result? Total annihilation. Castles burned to the ground, families fractured, but worst of all, it created this massive, irreversible ecological wound. Ancient, massive beasts and young hatchlings killed each other in the skies, wiping out entire generations of dragons. They literally destroyed their only real leverage. When the Civil War finally ended, the Targaryens were technically still kings sitting on the throne, but the equation had fundamentally changed. Without dragons, they lost their ultimate enforcement mechanism. They actually had to negotiate and compromise just like everyone else. The mystical aura totally vanished. They were forced to face a horrifying psychological realization. People obeyed because they were afraid, not because they actually believed. The gods hadn't chosen them, they had simply controlled the sky. And now, the sky was empty. Outro: The blood that ate itself. The Targaryen dynasty highlights a really profound universal truth of empire building. Power, even apocalyptic, world-ending firepower, is never enough on its own. Power needs a narrative. Dragons conquered Westeros, sure, but myth is what kept it. Prophecy justified it, religion sanctified it, and their blood preserved it, until that very same blood destroyed it. They survived the literal end of the world only to be undone by the oldest enemy in human history, themselves. Fire can absolutely melt a kingdom into submission, but it cannot stop a family from burning from within. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer on the hidden tactical and psychological truths behind this legendary dynasty. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. If dragons returned tomorrow, would humanity worship them all over again, or would we just repeat the exact same mistake? Let that sink in for a bit. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.